The greatest mistake many people make is believing that every battle is physical. But there are attacks that cannot be explained by logic. You see patterns that make no sense. Generations trapped in poverty, repeated divorces, children dying before destiny manifests, constant miscarriages, addictions that move from father to son, fear that follows an entire bloodline like a shadow. And people ask, why is this happening? Because behind many repeated afflictions, there is an altar still speaking. An altar is not just a table made of stones. An altar is a spiritual transaction point. It is a place where covenants are activated, a place where sacrifices speak, a place where invisible agreements are enforced. And whether people realize it or not, many families are still under the influence of altars built generations ago. Some were built through occult practices, some through idol worship, some through blood sacrifices, some through witchcraft rituals hidden in secrecy, and some were built through spoken curses released by people carrying spiritual authority in darkness. You may not have attended the rituals, you may not know who built the altar, but if the covenant was never broken, the altar continues demanding payment. This is why some people suffer battles they never created. You wonder why doors close suddenly, why confusion enters your mind without warning, why favor disappears when breakthrough is near, why strange dreams intensify after prayer, why your life feels delayed while others move forward. Because evil altars do not rest quietly. They demand cycles, they enforce captivity, and they resist freedom. There are people listening right now who have prayed for years, but the battle keeps returning. Not because God is weak, not because prayer does not work, but because some battles require confrontation at the root. You cannot heal the fruit while ignoring the root underground. And many roots are spiritual. There are families where every firstborn suffers, families where marriages collapse mysteriously, families where nobody keeps wealth, families where strange deaths happen at the same age, families where mental torment repeats itself across generations. This is not coincidence. This is spiritual inheritance operating through unbroken altars. The enemy understands something many believers ignore. If he can establish a legal spiritual ground in a bloodline, he creates long-term destruction. That is why ancient witchcraft systems focus heavily on family covenants, because they know bloodline agreements can outlive generations. There are things your grandparents touched that your generation is now fighting. And until someone rises with spiritual authority to destroy the altar, the cycle continues. Some people are dealing with altars hidden behind cultural practices, things celebrated publicly but rooted in darkness privately, objects buried in family compounds, rituals performed during childbirth, initiations disguised as traditions, secret dedications done over children before they could even speak. And years later, people wonder why they feel spiritually bound. The enemy works best when people remain unaware, because what you refuse to confront continues operating. There are believers who love God deeply but still experience strange oppression. Why? Because salvation changes your identity, but spiritual warfare still requires enforcement. You must confront what is fighting your destiny. You must speak against what is speaking against you. You must dismantle what hell has erected in your bloodline. Many people fear this subject because they think acknowledging spiritual warfare gives power to darkness. Number, ignoring darkness never defeats it. Exposure destroys secrecy. And once evil is exposed, it can be confronted. This is why many deliverances begin with revelation, because you cannot break chains you refuse to recognize. There are people who suddenly become exhausted every time they pray. Others feel resistance whenever they try to progress spiritually. Some experience terrifying dreams after seeking God seriously. Some encounter hatred from people they never harmed. And some carry a heaviness they cannot explain. These are not always random emotional struggles. Sometimes they are signs of spiritual resistance connected to altars demanding continued bondage. The enemy becomes nervous when someone in a family begins awakening spiritually, because one delivered person can break cycles for an entire generation. One praying mother can disrupt ancient covenants. One spiritually awakened son can challenge years of darkness. One person filled with the fire of God can silence an altar that ruled for decades. And this is why the warfare intensifies when breakthrough approaches. Hell fights hardest when freedom is near. Some of you have wondered why attacks increased after you began praying seriously, why confusion suddenly appeared, why temptation intensified, why people turned against you unexpectedly, why discouragement became overwhelming. Because something in the spirit recognized you were becoming dangerous. You were no longer sleeping spiritually. You are approaching the root. And when you approach the root, hidden altars react violently. The enemy fears believers who understand authority, not noise, not religion. Authority, because authority speaks with certainty. Authority confronts darkness directly. Authority does not negotiate with chains. And many believers have lived beneath the authority God already gave them. You were not called to remain intimidated by witchcraft. You were not called to fear ancestral darkness. You were not called to surrender to generational bondage. You were called to stand, to discern, to pray, to confront, to destroy the works of darkness through the authority of God. There comes a moment when somebody in the family must say, "This cycle ends with me." No more destruction, no more repeated captivity, no more inherited torment, no more silent oppression. That moment is dangerous to hell, because altars survive through silence, fear, and ignorance. But when truth enters a bloodline, everything begins to shake. And many people listening right now are beginning to realize something terrifying. The battle was never just physical. There has been a spiritual voice speaking against the family for years. But tonight, exposure has begun. And once exposure begins, one of the most dangerous things about family witchcraft is that it often hides behind familiarity. The people involved may smile around you, eat with you, celebrate with you, speak kindly in public. But spiritually, something darker is operating behind the curtain. Not every enemy comes from outside. Some battles are connected to people who have access to your life. And this is why discernment is critical. Because the enemy studies bloodlines carefully. He studies weaknesses, patterns, emotional wounds. He searches for doors. And once a door is opened, spiritual oppression begins entering like a flood. Many people think altars only function through rituals performed in forests or secret rooms. But sometimes the altar is activated through hatred, jealousy, bitterness, manipulation, control. Persistent spoken curses, words carry spiritual weight, especially when released repeatedly with intention. There are parents who spoke destruction over their children for years without understanding the damage they were creating. There will never be anything good in your life. You will fail like everyone else. You are cursed. You are useless. And those words become spiritual seeds planted into the atmosphere of a home. Words shape environments. This is why some houses feel heavy the moment you enter them. Constant fighting, constant fear, constant anger, constant confusion, no peace, no spiritual rest, because darkness has been fed consistently through destructive agreements. And many family altars survive through repeated cycles of negativity and spiritual ignorance. The enemy loves toxic patterns because they keep doors open. Unforgiveness becomes a doorway. Sexual immorality becomes a doorway. Occult objects become a doorway. Idolatry becomes a doorway. Addiction becomes a doorway. And once doors remain open long enough, spiritual oppression gains legal access. This is why some families experience constant chaos no matter how hard they try to improve naturally. The root is spiritual. There are people who cannot explain why success disappears suddenly. Every opportunity collapses. Every relationship becomes warfare. Every financial breakthrough evaporates mysteriously. And after years of confusion, exhaustion begins settling into the soul. You start wondering if freedom is even possible. That is exactly where the enemy wants you. Hopeless, drained, spiritually numb, because a hopeless believer becomes passive. And passive people rarely confront darkness. But something shifts when revelation enters your spirit. You begin recognizing the patterns. You begin noticing the repetition. You begin understanding that certain attacks are not random. And once discernment awakens, spiritual warfare becomes targeted. Now you stop fighting blindly. Now you stop normalizing bondage. Now you stop accepting captivity as your destiny. There are families where witchcraft operates through secret objects hidden for generations. Charms buried near homes. Dedicated items passed from one generation to another. Jewelry connected to occult rituals. Clothing used in ceremonies. Objects spiritually dedicated before being transferred into the family. Many people never question these things because they appear ordinary physically, but spiritually, they carry agreements attached to them. The enemy understands symbolism. That is why witchcraft often works through objects, rituals, and repeated actions. Because darkness seeks physical points of agreement to maintain spiritual influence. This is why spiritual cleansing matters, not superstition, discernment. There are times when God begins exposing things you previously ignored. Certain music, certain relationships, certain practices, certain places. and suddenly you feel disturbed in your spirit. That disturbance is not accidental, it is revelation. Because when God prepares someone for deliverance, exposure increases first. You begin seeing clearly, and clarity terrifies darkness. Some people listening right now have been experiencing unusual spiritual pressure recently, nightmares, oppressive heaviness, sudden fear, spiritual exhaustion, unexplainable tension, constant distraction during prayer. That is not always coincidence. Sometimes it is retaliation. Because when you start moving toward freedom, hidden altars react. The enemy does not surrender territory quietly, especially territory controlled for generations. There are people whose families mocked prayer for years, mocked holiness, mocked righteousness, mocked spiritual discipline. And now those same people wonder why destruction continues repeating. Because whatever dominates the spiritual atmosphere of a home eventually shapes the destiny of the people inside it. If darkness is constantly entertained, darkness grows stronger. If compromise becomes normal, spiritual resistance weakens. And eventually, entire bloodlines become spiritually vulnerable. But there is something witchcraft fears deeply: consistent spiritual fire, not occasional prayer, not emotional, religion, fire. Because spiritual fire breaks agreements, it exposes hidden things, it destroys demonic confidence. And many believers underestimate the authority released through disciplined prayer and obedience to God. There are altars that survived for decades until one person began praying consistently, one person fasting seriously, one person refusing compromise, one person speaking life instead of agreeing with destruction, one person choosing holiness despite pressure. And suddenly the spiritual atmosphere shifts because darkness cannot comfortably remain where sustained spiritual authority operates. This is why the enemy attacks your consistency so aggressively. He wants you distracted, tired, offended, spiritually unstable, because unstable believers rarely maintain the pressure necessary to break strongholds. But once you become spiritually disciplined, hell recognizes danger immediately. There are people listening to this right now who are carrying a calling to break cycles in their family. That is why your battles have been unusually intense. The enemy saw your potential before you did. He recognized the threat attached to your spiritual awakening, and he attempted to crush you before you fully discovered your authority. But you survived, despite the attacks, despite the betrayal, despite the confusion, despite the warfare. You survived because God preserved you for confrontation. You were not preserved merely to exist. You were preserved to destroy what has been destroying your family. This is why you cannot afford spiritual laziness anymore. Too much is connected to your obedience. Too many destinies are attached to your breakthrough. Too many future generations are waiting for somebody to stand up and say, enough, enough torment, enough manipulation, enough cycles, enough oppression, enough fear. And the moment that decision becomes serious inside your spirit, something begins shifting in the invisible realm. Because altars may speak, but authority speaks louder. And when a believer fully awakens to spiritual authority, family witchcraft begins losing its grip. There comes a moment in spiritual warfare when prayer alone is no longer casual conversation. It becomes confrontation. Because there are battles that do not move until spiritual authority is enforced aggressively. Many believers pray politely against systems that were built violently. But evil altars do not surrender because someone whispered a weak prayer once a month. Darkness resists until it encounters fire. And this is where many people fail. They become emotional during warfare but not consistent. They pray intensely for 2 days, then disappear spiritually for weeks. They declare freedom while continuing to entertain the very doors that keep bondage alive. And the enemy understands inconsistency. He studies it carefully. Because unstable believers are easier to exhaust. This is why destroying family altars requires more than emotional excitement. It requires spiritual endurance. You must become spiritually intentional. You must stop treating prayer like emergency medicine while living carelessly the rest of the time. Because altars are strengthened through repeated agreements, and they are destroyed through repeated spiritual resistance. There are people listening right now who keep returning to the same captivity because certain doors were never truly closed. You cannot ask God to destroy darkness while secretly protecting the things, feeding it. Some people want freedom while remaining connected to toxic relationships that drain their spirit. Others want breakthrough while continually compromising morally. Some desire deliverance but refuse forgiveness. And unforgiveness is one of the enemy's favorite weapons. Because bitterness keeps wounds spiritually open. The enemy loves unresolved pain. He feeds on resentment. He magnifies offense. He whispers revenge. Why? Because wounded hearts struggle to sustain spiritual authority. This is why healing matters in warfare. Not weakness, healing. Because broken emotions can become open gates if left untreated. There are people who were traumatized in childhood and never recovered spiritually, rejected, abused, humiliated, abandoned. And those wounds became entry points for fear, self hatred, addiction, and oppression. The enemy often begins building strongholds through pain, especially pain ignored for years. This is why God sometimes confronts your hidden wounds before confronting the external warfare, because inner healing strengthens spiritual resistance. You cannot fight effectively while bleeding internally. And many families carry generations of unhealed trauma, fathers passing pain to sons, mothers transferring fear to daughters, anger becoming inheritance, silence becoming culture, brokenness reproducing brokenness. And eventually, entire bloodlines normalize emotional destruction. But God never intended for dysfunction to become your identity. You were not created to inherit captivity permanently. You were created for freedom. Yet freedom requires separation from what feeds darkness. This is where warfare becomes uncomfortable, because sometimes God asks you to disconnect from environments that are poisoning your spirit. Certain friendships, certain habits, certain conversations, certain entertainments, certain traditions. And people resist this because they fear loneliness. But spiritual freedom often begins with painful separation. Not everyone connected to your past can follow you into deliverance. Some people only function comfortably around the weaker version of you. The moment you grow spiritually, they become uncomfortable. The moment you pursue holiness seriously, resistance begins. The moment you stop participating in destructive patterns, accusations appear. Why? Because your transformation exposes the bondage around you, and darkness hates exposure. There are believers who feel guilty for separating from spiritually toxic environments. But you cannot heal while constantly breathing poison. You cannot sustain fire while remaining surrounded by constant compromise. At some point, you must protect your spiritual atmosphere aggressively, because environments shape spiritual sensitivity. There are places where prayer becomes difficult immediately, places saturated with darkness, confusion, immorality, oppression. And if you remain there too long without discernment, your spiritual strength weakens gradually. This is why disciplined believers guard their atmosphere carefully. What enters your eyes matters. What enters your ears matters. What enters your heart matters. Because repeated exposure eventually shapes spiritual condition. The enemy understands this principle better than many believers do. That is why modern warfare is often subtle, slow corruption, slow compromise, slow desensitization. The goal is not always immediate destruction. Sometimes the enemy simply wants to weaken discernment, gradually until bondage feels normal. And this is exactly what happened in many families. Compromise became culture, prayer disappeared, holiness became mocked, darkness became entertainment, and eventually spiritual sensitivity died slowly. But revival begins when someone awakens, someone begins praying again, someone begins fasting again, someone begins reading the word seriously again, someone begins rejecting compromise boldly again. And suddenly spiritual atmosphere changes. Sustained obedience releases power. Many people underestimate the authority of consistent obedience. They search for dramatic moments while ignoring daily discipline. But strong believers are not built overnight. Authority grows through consistency, prayer when tired, obedience when tempted, faith when discouraged, worship during warfare, holiness under pressure. That is how spiritual strength develops. And once authority matures, evil altars begin collapsing. Not because of human power, because darkness cannot permanently withstand sustained spiritual fire. There are families where one praying grandmother held back destruction for decades, one intercessor protecting generations through prayer, one person standing in the gap while others remain spiritually asleep. Never underestimate the power of one spiritually serious believer. Hell certainly does not. This is why the enemy attacks praying people aggressively. Distraction, fatigue, condemnation, fear, anything to silence the fire. Because prayer shifts atmospheres. Prayer weakens strongholds. Prayer exposes hidden operations. Prayer invites divine intervention into impossible situations. And when prayer becomes consistent, altars begin losing power. There are some of you listening right now who have been feeling a stirring in your spirit recently, a hunger for deeper prayer, a burden for your family, a growing discomfort with compromise. That stirring is not accidental. God is waking you up for battle, not physical battle, spiritual confrontation. Because somebody in your bloodline must rise with authority. Somebody must refuse the cycles. Somebody must confront the darkness previous generations tolerated. And perhaps that person is you. Perhaps you are the one chosen to break what others could not break. Perhaps you are the one called to stand where others surrendered. Perhaps you are the one carrying the fire that will finally silence the altars speaking against your family. But if you are going to win this battle, you cannot remain half awake spiritually. This warfare requires focus, discipline, discernment, consistency, and complete dependence on God. Because family altars are not destroyed casually. They are destroyed when somebody becomes spiritually dangerous enough that darkness can no longer maintain control. The final stage of destroying family altars is not just breaking chains, it is establishing a new spiritual legacy. Because if an altar is destroyed but nothing righteous replaces it, the cycle attempts to return. This is why many people experience temporary freedom but later fall back into bondage. The house was cleaned but never filled with spiritual fire. Deliverance is not the end. It is the beginning of a new spiritual foundation. And this is where many believers must become intentional. You cannot destroy darkness while refusing to build light. You must establish new patterns, new disciplines, new spiritual habits, because every family is shaped by whatever dominates its spiritual atmosphere consistently. For years, many bloodlines were shaped by fear, manipulation, occult influence, violence, perversion, poverty thinking, constant chaos. And after generations, people begin believing dysfunction is normal. But when God begins restoration, He changes the atmosphere first. Peace enters where confusion once ruled. Wisdom enters where destruction once dominated. Purity enters where compromise once thrived. And slowly, a new spiritual culture begins forming. This is why your decisions matter more than you realize. The way you pray matters. The way you speak matters. The way you live matters. Children absorb atmospheres long before they understand words. Families are shaped by repeated spiritual patterns. If prayer becomes normal inside a home, spiritual sensitivity grows. If righteousness becomes valued, discernment strengthens. If truth becomes honored, darkness loses influence. But if compromise remains entertained, bondage quietly rebuilds itself. This is why spiritual vigilance is necessary even after breakthrough. The enemy often returns looking for re-entry points, old temptations, old relationships, old mindsets, old habits, because darkness always seeks familiar doors. And many people lose battles after victory because they stop guarding the gates. Never assume freedom means warfare is over. It means authority must remain active. There are believers who experienced powerful deliverance moments but slowly drifted back into spiritual carelessness. Prayer disappeared, discernment weakened, compromise returned quietly, and eventually oppression returned stronger than before. Why? Because unguarded territory becomes vulnerable territory. This is why discipline protects deliverance. You must protect your atmosphere intentionally. There are conversations that weaken your spirit, entertainment that numbs discernment, relationships that drain conviction, places that reactivate old bondage. And mature believers learn to recognize these things quickly, not out of fear, out of wisdom. Because spiritual survival requires discernment. The enemy studies behavior patterns constantly. He watches for exhaustion, isolation, offense, distraction, moments when spiritual defenses weaken. And if believers are not alert, old cycles attempt to rebuild themselves silently. This is why humility is critical after breakthrough. Never become spiritually arrogant. Never assume you are untouchable. Stay prayerful, watchful, stay dependent on God. Because sustained victory flows through sustained connection with Him. Many people want authority without intimacy with God. But true spiritual authority is not performance. It flows from relationship. Darkness recognizes authentic authority, not religious noise, not public appearances. Authentic authority. This is why some people speak loudly but nothing changes spiritually, while others pray quietly and entire atmospheres shift. Because spiritual power is rooted in alignment with God. And alignment produces confidence, not fear, not panic, confidence. You begin understanding that witchcraft is not greater than the authority of God. Curses are not stronger than truth. Altars are not stronger than divine power. The enemy survives through intimidation and ignorance. But once a believer fully awakens spiritually, intimidation loses power. This is why the enemy fights revelation so aggressively. because informed believers become dangerous believers. And there are people listening right now who are finally understanding the true nature of their battles, the strange resistance, the repeated cycles, the invisible pressure, the warfare around destiny. Now the pieces are connecting, and with revelation comes responsibility. You cannot return to spiritual sleep after this. Too much has been exposed, too much has been revealed. You now understand that some battles require spiritual confrontation, that some cycles must be broken intentionally, some doors must remain permanently closed, and that your family's future may depend on the spiritual decisions you make today. There are children connected to your obedience, future generations connected to your prayers, destinies connected to your spiritual discipline. Never underestimate the impact of one surrendered life. One person walking in obedience can shift an entire bloodline. One person carrying spiritual fire can alter generational outcomes. One person refusing compromise can create protection for future generations they may never even meet. This is why your warfare matters. This is why your consistency matters. This is why your prayer life matters. Hell understands the power of a spiritually awakened believer. That is why the attacks intensified when you started seeking God seriously. The enemy recognized movement. He recognized danger. He recognized that somebody in the family was finally waking up. But what darkness hoped would destroy you actually prepared you. Betrayal taught discernment. The warfare taught endurance. The pain taught dependence on God. The attacks taught spiritual authority. And now you are standing stronger than before. Not because the battle was easy, but because God preserved you through it. There are people listening right now who nearly gave up, nearly surrendered, nearly accepted bondage as permanent. But something kept pulling you back toward God. Something kept reigniting your hunger. Something kept whispering, "Do not quit." That was not random. That was divine preservation. Because your story was never meant to end in captivity. Your bloodline was never meant to remain chained forever. And the moment you fully understand your authority, everything changes. Fear begins breaking. Confidence begins rising. Discernment becomes sharper. Prayer becomes stronger. And darkness begins losing territory it controlled for years. This is the season where cycles break. This is the season where spiritual blindness ends. This is the season where hidden altars are exposed and destroyed, not through human strength, not through fear, but through the authority and power of God operating through a believer who finally decided to stand. The altar that fought your family will not survive your awakening. What controlled previous generations will lose its power when you stand in spiritual authority. You are not powerless, you are not abandoned, and you are not destined to repeat cycles of destruction forever. The fire of God is stronger than every hidden covenant, every curse, and every voice speaking against your destiny. Tonight, chains are breaking, darkness is retreating, and a new legacy is beginning through you. Now stand boldly, pray fiercely, and never surrender your authority again.